Hi again, folks. This is Jeffrey Donaldson with another Jeweler's Eye reading of a single poem from a recent book published by a Canadian poet. This time around, we're going to be taking a look at a very fine little piece called The Tree in Winter, a poem by Anne Compton, published in her new book entitled Alongside, Fitzhenry and Whiteside, 2013. The Tree in Winter. The tree in winter is near to pure form, sonnet without content, ghazal in grey. Sap sunk to root, fibrous root thirsting its way to water table, while bare limbs conform to loss. No conduction can be inferred. Still, there's an underground to everything. The way our absence, even now, is moving in some element unamenable to word or syntax. If lingual, let it be what stones here. I don't want to know if you recant, or why, the beauty you lifted vein by vein through me, knowing only I'll not be that again. Now, you don't want to be tricked by the second line to conclude that this is a sonnet. It is only 12 lines, 3 rhyming quatrains, so it falls 2 lines short of a sonnet. These reflections are partly invited by the questions of pure form. The poem is partly going to be about the forms of things, right away naming the form of a poem, which it does not self purely or altogether satisfy. So there are going to be tongues-in-cheek in the poem. There are going to be demurrings with respect to its own accomplishment of the pure form it puts on the table. Pure forms. I can't resist again taking a close-ish look at the title. We have an object and a season. To say something like the tree in winter is to say something like a symbol inside a state of mind. But we could have more fun with the title than that. If you look very closely at the letters, you can see a kind of pattern. The tree gives us a symmetrical pattern of T's and E's, the T and E of the aligning with the T and E's of tree. And then similarly across the divide, you have the IN in aligning with the IN inside winter. And if we wanted to be even more audacious, we could notice that there is in both nouns of the title TREs, T's, R's, and E's. The TRE of tree returning to us in the TER of winter. So we might want to say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that there is actually a tree in winter, even if that tree is missing a second E and being jumbled up is somewhat gnarled and missing a branch. But there's certainly lots going on there, and we could say that there is a kind of echoic refrain of letter patterns in those two nouns, and just so we'll be looking for echoic patterns to unfold through the rest of the poem. And so that's very much the reason why we would want to say that the first line is literally and figuratively true, that the tree in winter is near to pure form. Compton is telling us something about the object of a tree standing alone in a wintry landscape, that there is something of pure form that we associate with such a scene, but that the actual phrase, the tree in winter, which is the title of the poem, directs our attention back to the pure forms of how it's going to go about evoking its experience. The invitation to think of the title and the poem as embodying aspects of pure form is affirmed in the second line, of course, where the actual tree in winter is associated with two kinds of poems, sonnets and ghazals. Trees in winter come near to pure form because they are missing their leaves, so we get to see the skeletal structure. And so the pure form of a tree in winter would be like a sonnet that didn't have any content but was the pure form of the sonnet. First thing we might want to ask about that is it possible for a sonnet not to have any content? Well, Compton is raising that possibility here, and there is a sense in the poem that there is a content that is at stake in the poem that is not being stated explicitly. And in a very real sense, the poem does not name its subject. We'll come to that in a minute, but it is quite demure on the question of its explicit subject, and so could perhaps come closer to this sense of a poem that has form, but like a tree in winter, no leaves. Well, what about this subject matter? Sonnets and ghazals. Hearing these two verse forms, if you were asked to say the first thing that came into your mind, it might very well be love poetry. The tradition of the love sonnet in English verse is one of the oldest traditions that we have in literature, and the same goes for the ghazal in Persian literature, both highly condensed, highly rarefied, gem-like artifacts in which the one or two bright impressions that one would want to make in the revelation of such an intense emotional experience might come to bear. So the question of the love poem is invoked, and yet we know that this will be a fairly ironic invocation of the love poem. Just as a tree in winter comes near to pure form, so this poem, The Tree in Winter, gives us the pure form of what would otherwise be poems of love with the usual contents of love poetry that we associate with those genres, but now here reduced to their most essential elements. So this is a love poem still, yes, but a love poem that looks at what we usually cannot see disguised beneath the usual available contents of a love poem. What is it that lies hidden there? What is it that in this season, in this state of mind, we can finally see was there all along? The other quieter sense in which this is a poem without content has to do with the fact that its addressee is absent. A love poem without content would be a love poem where its subject was no longer present. But we'll pick up a little bit of this at the end of the poem too. So Compton is going to explore the metaphoric implications of the pure form of the tree in winter, a form that has itself been used by earlier poets to express something of their experience of love. Here Compton is going to focus in that much more intensely on the actual form of the tree itself to find further metaphoric inferences in what we know about its inner structure. So look at how she works with her image patterns here. We have solids and we have substances that flow. We have the vertical metaphor of upper and lower worlds in such terms as sunk, conduction, underground, lifted, so on. So higher and lower worlds, if you like, and everything that those are going to mean, and the flowing substances that will pass between them. We have root and fibrous limb, and the whole notion of conduction itself, and vein. Compton coming very close in the last image to both the human body and the tree in winter. That becomes a metaphor for a certain experience of love. So this is the winter season, the late season, the season of loss and letting go, the trees letting go of their leaves, sap sinking down to roots, those roots thirsting their way down to the water table, but where in the upper visible world the bare limbs themselves, nice metaphoric split there between the limbs of a tree and the limbs of a human body, the bare limbs themselves conform to and articulate their actual losses. They manifest those losses as only a bare tree could. No conduction can be inferred. Curious, rather abstract statement that Compton makes here. This really very beautiful thought that looking at bare limbs, you mightn't imagine that there are still fibrous roots thirsting their way down to the water table, but that there are. And so Compton says, almost explicitly, at something like a turn in the poem where we move from somewhat negative statement of the situation, sap sunk to roots, the fibrous roots thirsting their way down, while the bare limbs are conforming to loss, where looking at it, you wouldn't imagine that anything was flowing any longer, period, and then the turn. Still, there's an underground to everything. What an excellent play there in that phrase. Of course, she's partly telling us that there's an underground to everything, meaning that there's an underground to this poem. There is an underground to the love sonnet tradition. There are appearances, and then there are the realities and experiences that go their way beneath those appearances. And so, too, there is an underground to the actual scene that we are imagining here. And look how Compton moves gingerly from the idea of an underground to the idea of an absence. The absence is not the underground itself. It is something that is able to move there. It moves in an element beneath the explicit word, beneath the obvious syntactical orders and arrangements, but can nonetheless be intuited within them. And so too then we can imagine that there is an absence moving within everything that this poem will be saying explicitly. There is an absence that passes within it, that lies beneath its explicit expressions and forms, in the same way that beneath the surface of the ground there are fibrous roots that still thirst after the water table. Compton is a wonderful poet of word textures, language textures, and I find you can see it in these lines, the way your absence even now is moving in some element unamenable to word. You just want to try those words on again and again. Some element unamenable to word. Some element unamenable. So the MEN of element picking up the MEN of amenable. Element unamenable. The EL at the beginning of the word, turning in at the end of unamenable. Of course, Compton is talking about forces that move inside other forces that are perhaps more obvious, and just so in lines like this we can imagine that there is what the word says explicitly, but then there are absent forces that move within them that are very like these kinds of letter and textual patterns that she manifests at the same time. So once again, this is a poetry that is partly performing and executing what it is also talking about. And so we come to the final lines. If lingual, let it be what stones hear. So we're talking here about the particular form that the absence is going to assume as it moves through the element unamenable to word or syntax. If lingual, meaning if it has anything to do with language, if it is spoken in any way, then let it be what stones hear. So you've got some idea of an expressive potential in language that is nonetheless silent or of a different order of audibility altogether. But it's hard to avoid the other inference in the term lingual. Lingual, of course, related to tongue, and the physical reality of the sensual body is fairly present throughout the whole poem in words such as sap and limbs, vein by vein, but also very definitely in a term like lingual. This is a very quiet and modest invocation of sensual activity. And of course, at some point we let the other shoe fall and say that if it's going to be lingual but not spoken, then there must be other activities for the tongue that would manage something like the same expressive potential. And so that's all there, quietly and beautifully moving beneath the surface of everything that we see. So the end of the poem is essentially a response to the communicative gesture that's made by the absent one, that is moving in some element unamenable to word or syntax. The speaker is trying to understand the nature of that communication. Why does the speaker want the gesture, if it is lingual, to be only what stones hear? She says, I don't want to know if you recant or why the beauty you lifted vein by vein through me. So the interesting thing about the word recant is it points in almost opposite directions. The root of the word is the Latin cantare, which means to sing. The Latin prefix re serves two different purposes, almost opposed to one another. The re prefix can mean both back or again. Probably the first sense that we hear when we hear this word is a taking back of something. To recant means to renounce, to disavow a claim, a statement, an action, So we would partly be thinking about how the absent one's withdrawal from the world would amount to a withdrawal of the beauty that the speaker once felt passing through her. And it would be a withdrawal, a recanting, because the absent one is absent. So there is there a very moving sense of the absent one's absence is a kind of singing or a sounding back into absence of what was once made so present through her. But the other meaning of recant in musical terminology means either to rehearse or to sing again. This now then is repetition, rehearsal, a sense of an opening forward, and for a poem that is going to conclude with this no-nonsense announcement of an end to things, a possible singing again must resonate significantly. But then what is it that the absent one in being absent recants? It is the beauty you lifted vein by vein through me. And here for the first time in the poem we have energies rising rather than falling. Earlier the fibrous roots were thirsting their way down to the water table. This reversal of the vertical axis, so that we're now looking at a lift or a rising, is a counterpoint to the temporal dimension of the poem, where we start with an event that is unfolding in the present, but as the poem unfolds we move through the absence into the past, and it is in that past that the ascent manifests itself. We think of moving from the present to the past as a downward movement in this poem and elsewhere, but that downward movement has a kind of counterpointing initiative in an upward movement, but it is a hopeful moment in the poem, even though it's a moment that has occurred in the past. But that it was in the past, that it is a compromised lifting against the descent, is only too vividly captured in the closing sentence, which, as I say, is so no-nonsense, so simple in its naming the grim truth, knowing only I'll not be that again. Just to make sense of the logic here, why doesn't it matter if you recant or renounce or take back that beauty that I once experienced? Well, because I know I'll not be that again. The logic there is that that sense of beauty is already escaped or lost in the past, which all sounds very grim and despairing at the end of the poem, but we want to sit for a little while longer just with this last line, I'll not be that again. It strongly recalls the absence, right? The way your absence is moving even now. So the I'll not be that again circles back upon itself as somehow participating in what still moves through her in an element unamenable to word. So while there seems to be a fairly explicit fatality in the knowledge at the end of the poem, that knowledge itself seems to pick up again on the thing that is no longer, that we've already experienced as in motion still within her, very much in the way that something still moves within her, returning us back to the image of the tree in winter again, of a form that may appear to have conforming bare limbs, but where the very experience of loss that those bare limbs express disguise within it something that is still at work, something that is still searching, still thirsting. The experience of absence itself as another way of thirsting. The poem concluding with I'll not be that again would do the surest work of that thirsting, because it allows itself just to be what it is. And it's maybe on that note that we would want to finish up. That is, we were told at the beginning that the tree in winter is near to pure form in the same way that a sonnet without content is near to pure form. This is a sonnet that only comes near to being a sonnet, but it does, though, seem to have a content. That content, though, is partly about an absence. It names that absence explicitly, but what it doesn't name is the absent one. And insofar as the poem doesn't have a content, we imagine that an unnamed one, an absent one, is the unnamed presence that is still moving in some element unamenable to word or syntax, which is the poem itself. So Compton has created a poem in which an unnamed figure abides beneath everything that is made explicit in the poem and becomes the absence that moves there. never so real as when it is revealed under these conditions. And so the poem itself, in embodying this unnamed, present, absent one, becomes itself the fibrous root that thirsts its way down to whatever water table poems finally drink from. Let's let that do for Anne Compton's The Tree in Winter. The poem again is included in her new volume entitled Alongside, published by Fitzhenry and Whiteside, 2013.